This is 91.3 FM, wcuw in Worcester, Massachusetts, the Dr. Chris Radio Horror Program. And tonight on the show, we have in the studio with us the widow of the author, John Bellairs, who has a movie coming out based on one of his novels, The House with the Clock in Its Walls, but his ex-wife was kind enough to come in the studio with us to talk a little bit about her late husband's body of work, who he was, and maybe some tidbits about the set, if she's allowed to talk about anything. Sometimes you're under embargo not to talk about anything, but we'll see what we can squeeze out of her. Thank you so much for coming in the studio with us.
You're very welcome.
I really do appreciate it. When I was 10 years old and I was in Maryland, Germantown, Maryland, I was in my local library. My elementary school had just gotten built. It was a Captain James Daly Elementary School named after a fallen police officer. And it was right behind the condo complex that I lived, so all the neighborhood kids were kind of sent there away from the previous elementary school that we'd all gone to. And I was looking for a book to do a book report on, and I was in the library, and I came across The Figure in the Shadows. And I did a book report on that in the 4th grade, and then I did another book report on it in the 6th grade because I was so familiar with the book. And that's when I was in the 6th grade, I was exposed to more of the books. And despite my father not really being into those type of novels, I read as many as I could get out of the library. And then as an adult, I started hunting them down and buying them as quickly as possible. And now my son, who his reading skills have improved a lot, at the age of 11, he's in the 5th grade. I've gotten him to start to read them out loud to me to help his reading skills. And he's actually reading right now the From the Zombie and the something.
Yes.
That one. That one. You had mentioned over the phone that you had worked on some of these books with John. Is that correct?
No, that wouldn't be exactly right. I typed them.
You typed them.
I typed
You
manuscripts.
did work on them then.
I worked on them, but not in the sense
that is
of
a
the
very important
part.
job. Was he not a great typist?
He used a manual typewriter all his life. He was not a great typist. And he wrote most of the first 3 in that trilogy in longhand first.
The house,
starting with The House with the Clock in Its Walls.
Then that was the first book that he ever wrote?
No, it was not. It's the first one that was specifically aimed at young adults.
Okay. But the first of those supernatural kind of books that eventually came out, right?
There is one earlier called The Face in the Frost.
Okay.
Which is an adult fantasy, science fiction. I'm not sure it crosses genres.
Okay.
It has been a cult favorite ever since it came out. It wasn't wildly popular when it was first published, but it has plodded on through the years, being republished, most recently by the New England Science Fiction Press.
Ooh, neat.
The Mythopoeic Society loves it.
Mm-hmm.
It has a great following. It is not a children's book, however.
Mm-hmm. Is that the only adult novel that he wrote, or did he write others?
Really, the only adult novel. The first 2 books that he published were, well, one of them was a myth, a sort of fantasy, but the very first one was called Saint Fidgeta and Other Parodies, and it was a book of satires based on his Catholic upbringing and his experience teaching at Catholic colleges.
Mm-hmm. And then the book that the movie's coming out was written in 1973. Okay.
That's correct.
The House with a Clock in Its Walls.
Right.
And then followed up by The Figure in the Shadows and The Letter of the Witch in the Ring, which is kind of like a spin-off, really, because it's about you had this what's the way to put it? All-female kind of book, because it was about the
Rose Rita becomes the main character.
Correct. Yeah, and then the old woman too. That's being played by Kate Blanchett, which is a very unusual casting, considering you look at all the photos of this woman, and you're like, Kate Blanchett is not that old.
One of the things that was startling is that she has not been made spectacularly old for the movie either.
No, I've seen the trailer. I've only ever seen that one trailer, and Jack Black, who plays the wise old uncle, looks like Jack Black and not aged either.
That's right.
The kid who plays Lewis is also extremely looks a lot younger and also skinnier compared to Lewis, who is kind of overweight in the books.
The only thing that worries me about the movie, having been down to see the filming, is the skinny lead there. Mm-hmm. I don't know how they have adapted things in order to accommodate Owen Vaccaro, who's a wonderful little actor, but he's not fat.
No.
And Lewis is fat.
Maybe they are. I mean, you got to think about the time in 1970s when your husband wrote those books. Child obesity wasn't looked upon as a bad thing, as whereas today, and you have a obese child in a movie, people kind of scoff at it sometimes. And maybe the producers are like, let's avoid any backlash and just cast a skinny kid.
That could be the case.
Whereas, like in Stephen King's It, they had to cast a chubby kid because that chubby kid grows up to be not a bodybuilder, but he takes his health very seriously as an adult. If you're familiar with what I'm talking about, the Losers Club in Stephen King's It.
But yeah, for John, the point of Lewis being stout was that John was fat as a child.
Oh, that's interesting.
And
okay.
He's drawing on his own childhood experiences in that book.
Okay.
So that there will be in the movie things that are changed, I know, from the original.
Of course, yeah.
But,
Hollywood's that's Hollywood's thing.
But I'm just not sure how they're handling the bullying part of that.
That will be interesting, and hopefully we'll connect with a younger audience that has had that problem before,
Yes.
like a kid going to see it and go, "That's me on screen," and I now know how to deal with it better myself. Now, I've heard that the house with a clock in its walls is actually based on a real house.
There is a splendid mansion that looks very much like Edward Gorey's conception on the front cover, called the Cronin Mansion in Marshall, Michigan. Mm-hmm. And Marshall has capitalized on that in recent years. I regret to say, in the years since John died, I don't believe that the plaque for the Cronin Mansion was put up before he died. Much of Marshall's pride in him seems to have come after his death. Marshall is proud of him now and has been holding a Bellairs Day, I understand, in late summer each year, and is planning a whole series of events around the release of the movie.
Oh, interesting. We've been on the Radio of Horror YouTube page. We have been creating miniature reviews based on the top 10 favorite books of John's, with the slideshow of the different artworks and covers. They're about 2 to 5 minutes apiece. We just did the Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt, and then we did the one on John himself, just giving our own little insight and thoughts and our own oral history that I went over at the beginning of this episode about where we got exposed to John. Did any of the stories come from any kind of influence in his own life beyond him being a chubby kid like Lewis?
Oh, yes. He drew heavily on his own experience for everything, or the experiences of people he knew.
John dealt with a lot of doomsday prophecy problems and black magic and evil sorcerers. Wow, what a life he led.
No, but in setting and character.
Okay.
Always. In plot, it was his imagination.
Gotcha.
But in setting and characters and details.
Did you ever hear the story of how Wes Craven ever created Freddy Krueger? It was I believe there was a kid that used to beat him up when he was in school, I think named Fred or Freddy. And then one night he was in his apartment his bedroom. When he was a kid, he was in the bedroom of his apartment, and he was looking outside after hearing some noise, and there was an old man with a long trench coat and a fedora rummaging through the garbage, and he looked up at him, and Wes ducked down. And then a few moments later, he looked outside to see if the man was gone, and the guy was still across the street looking up at his bedroom, scaring the crap out of him. He never knew who the guy was. He never saw him ever again. But the guy had the features like Freddy Krueger, not maybe a burnt face, but maybe a cracked, very craggy, kind of cracked up face. And a lot of this influenced him to create Freddy Krueger.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that. There's one very sad fact from John's childhood. He used to describe how extremely fearful he felt when he lay in bed at night and his father came home from the tavern that he owned late, and his father and mother argued.
Oh.
And he described his trauma listening to the arguments. And I think it's not that he experienced or searched for doomsday or
Doomsday chessmen of doom.
But there was in his childhood this which traumatized him and made him fearful of insecure.
When did you guys meet?
We met in the spring of 1968 at an Easter Eve party where a friend of ours had just been confirmed, as a matter of fact, in the Episcopal Church, and there was a big party afterwards. We met and were married in the space of 8 weeks.
Oh,
so
wow.
we didn't know much about each other when we got married.
That's, I guess maybe even in the 60s that would still be, I guess, normal. But today that people would go, "You're crazy! You don't know anything about this woman."
It horrified all our friends. It was uncharacteristic for either of us to have done anything like that.
Or someone would say, "You don't know anything about that man. What does he write? Books? That's no future."
Well, and at that point, he had published 2 books and was working on Face in the Frost.
Oh.
So he did identify himself as an author, and his friends knew and that's certainly what he wanted to do, but he was still holding a teaching job in order to keep bread on the table.
And you yourself work at a university right now? You're a professor?
At the time, I was a graduate student
Okay.
at Harvard, and I became a community college teacher. I spent my whole career at Northern Essex Community College in Haverhill.
Oh, wow. And are you still a professor now? Or
I retired 10 years ago.
10 years ago?
Scarcely believe that that's the case.
What do you do in your retirement, on your day-to-day?
Well, continuing. In 2000, I returned to playing the cello, which I had done in junior high and high school.
Oh.
And once I retired in 2007, the end of 2007, I was able to give more time to the cello. I play with the Portsmouth Symphony Orchestra, which
Wow.
is the very outside limit of my cello abilities. And therefore, during the season from September through June, that's all I play.
That's amazing.
But it's been a great pleasure. And I've made a whole new group of friends who are adult cellists. I spend a week every year at Summer Keys up in Maine, in Lubec, Maine, where there's a wonderful adult music program.
Now, you also said to me, because you had to correct me, you're John's widow, but you're also his ex-wife. You guys divorced?
We separated in 1980 and divorced amicably in 1984. We had the cheapest divorce I know of in the world.
That's my ex-wife and I had the cheapest divorce ever. It was pretty easy.
I found a book with the appropriate forms, copied them out, and the combination of fees and copying came to $75.25.
That's
And
cheap
we appeared
then, yeah. Compared to 2018.
So.
But you're like the heiress to his estate, or you carry the legacy of his. I mean, because the studio came to you to have you on set and everything.
I have a 1/3 ownership of this particular property. Initially, when John died, his estate went entirely to our son. Mm-hmm. Our son died in 1999.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
And therefore, I inherited from my son.
Okay.
Our son. And that seemed very straightforward until 2003, when there was a proposed movie deal that very nearly came to fruition, but at the last minute, the movie property person the lawyer who was given the material to review, said that she did not think I was the rightful owner. The literary agent and I found this bizarre because
John dead and your son dead,
However,
unless there's some skeleton in John's closet you didn't know about.
No, but I knew very well that there were 2 living siblings. There was a brother and a sister who lived in Marshall, Michigan, from whom John had been largely alienated much of his adult life, and who had never shown any particular interest in his writing career or anything.
Oh, until of course Hollywood comes along. Because Hollywood has nothing but money.
Well, no, that was not the initial deal. The initial deal was a change in copyright law that had happened in the 80s that none of us had been paying attention to.
Oh, no, but I mean these relatives that he had been
Yes.
separated from weren't interested until Hollywood came along.
They almost weren't interested then. It's only because it turned out that the movie lawyer was right. I was not the rightful owner.
Oh.
The copyright for House, which was published in 1973, had renewed in 2001. We're talking here about 2003, roughly. It had renewed in 2001, and what we didn't know was that copyrights under the old law that had 28 years in their first issue, when they renew, if the original owner is dead, and John was, if his estate is closed, and it was, if the original inheritor is dead, and our son was, then unless there is specific legal action at the time of the renewal automatically reverts to the nearest biological relative, the nearest living biological relative. And both John's brother and sister were living then.
Okay.
They were the relative.
Gotcha.
They got the copyright.
Okay. So they
It was pretty straightforward.
So that stopped the movie in 2003.
And that ended up stopping the movie in 2003 because two other copyrights had also renewed by then, and by 2004 when this dragged on. The whole trilogy, in other words, the whole original trilogy. But there had to be a settlement on what part I was going to have, given that I owned the other books about Louis Barneveld.
What about the other books with like Johnny and
And I owned the Johnny Dixon, and I owned the Anthony Munday,
Yep,
and
that's
I
what-
owned the earlier ones,
Okay.
ultimately. But all that had to be worked out legally, and a settlement made around those things.
Okay.
And the settlement we made was that for all the material about Louis Barneveld, Suzanne and Frank Bellairs in Michigan would get 2/3, and I would get 1/3 of the profits from what came. Movie companies want to buy, usually, the entire intellectual property involving characters.
Because they want their own cinematic universe these days.
Exactly. And because
It doesn't always work out that way because they like, let's rush it all into one thing. And like, no, why don't you just make the first book, set that book by itself, no connection, and like no hint drops of like, what's that? A figure in the shadows? End
Well.
credit scene. Hey everyone, Dr. Chris from the Radio Horror Show here. There's going to be a cut right here as Priscilla revealed something about the ending to The House with the Clock in its Walls that needs to remain off the air and between us. So that's why it's cut, and I'm cutting into this interview. But I now return you to our regularly scheduled interview with the widow of John Bellairs here on Radio Horror.
the movie company is interested in keeping the options open for something good to happen after this movie.
If this movie does well at the
If
box
this movie
office.
does well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Children's fantasy films are always hit or miss. I mean, this got a couple big name stars. So Eli Roth is huge. You know, the horror community loves him. Eric Kripke has a huge following, Supernatural.
And he was a wonderful person, too.
Which one,
Toward
Eli
this
Roth
one.
or
Eli Roth.
Eric Kripke? Did you get to meet Eric Kripke, the writer?
No, we
Okay.
did not. We met Brad Fisher, the producer, and Eli Roth, the director.
Okay, I'm familiar with Brad Fisher. Eric Kripke, if you're not aware, he was the creator of the TV series Supernatural, which has just ended its 13th season, and next season will be its 14th
Right.
season, which is unbelievable for a show, and it's currently on the CW.
Right.
Kripke is much beloved by Supernatural fans for creating these characters of Sam and Dean Winchester. So the fact that he's attached to this movie that has supernatural elements to it, you know, Supernatural fans were immediately like, wow, this is so cool that the guy who created our beloved show is working on this, you know, property directed by Eli Roth, who's, you know, this big acclaimed horror director. Love or hate his work, he's very popular. So depending on if you've seen have you seen his Hostel movies?
No, I haven't.
They take a long time to get there because you're just scratching your head going, where the hell's the horror? Oh my god, there it is. You literally are sitting through like the first two movies, the first film, let's just say, it takes like 30 to 40 minutes to get there, and then when it gets there, you're just like, oh, that was disgusting.
The only thing I know about Eric Kripke actually is I was told that he, like you, was a fan of Bellairs' books when he was growing up.
I did hear that, and I have heard that before when he was creating Supernatural, and he was doing a lot of press to promote the show. In the first 5 seasons, he was the showrunner. People asked him, where did you get the influence for Supernatural from? And he's like, there were these children's books. Now, I don't remember if he mentioned John or not,
Right.
but he said that there were children's books I read with artwork by Edward Gorey, and I was like, that has to be John's books.
right.
And I remember hearing that years ago and always being like, that's so cool. So come circa 2017 when the trailer came out, or 2018, whenever the trailer came out, to hear that he was the writer, I was like, what? Actually, it was announced last year, I think, and then the trailer came out this year.
Yes, that's right.
How did they contact you and to come to ask you to come to the set and everything? What's the story there?
Well, first they had to pay me. And at the point that it was clear that this was going into production, we were in communication, and they just issued an invitation and said that if I could come down to Atlanta, they would be happy to show me around the set. And I took my honorary grandson, who was 9 years old, Alexander, just the age the book was written for, and his mother. And and the three of us were treated like royalty for 2 days. First on the production sets, which was fascinating to me because I've never seen a big movie being made. I've read about how it's done, but watching it is really amazing.
Were you allowed to take any photos from the set or anything?
No.
Or? No? Okay.
No. However, there was a photographer silently following us around. We had a minder, of course, the whole time, a lovely woman named Tracy Nyberg, who was Brad Fisher's assistant. And at the end, we were presented with a set of photos taken by that photographer for our personal use.
Oh, that's
So
awesome.
I have photographs that I've been able to show to my friends, but not post online.
And you can't
or
post online till September, probably.
at least, and not, in social media or anything like that.
We would love to see those photos once you're legally allowed to post them on the
I'd
internet.
be happy to
That would be awesome.
share them with you when
yeah,
it's a possibility.
that is very, very cool.
The only place where we were able to take photos was on the second day of our visit. We were not on the production sets. We were on location in Decatur, Georgia, at an old elementary school where an elementary school scene was being shot. So it was outdoors a great deal, and the neighborhood of Decatur lined up watching on their porches what was going on across the street. It was fun to watch that whole huge operation move outdoors with its trucks and parts and wardrobe and food everywhere. I had no idea that movies required so much food.
Oh my God, yeah. Did you get to see the house itself?
Yes.
Okay, so were you overwhelmed with a sense
I
of
should say, I have to correct that because there is a house, an outdoor real house in Georgia
Okay.
that is part of this, which I did not see.
Oh, okay.
However, on the set, all the interiors are fully built.
Okay, yeah.
And
That's usually how it is.
They were amazing, just
Okay.
amazing.
And did they...
Comparable to the Harry Potter kinds of, elaborate.
Now, there's not a lot of, Edward Gorey drawings of, the inside of the house. I think there's, one of the outside, and there's, one of the inside. But it's, the fireplace, right?
But there's a great deal of description, and
Yeah.
they were trying to follow meticulously the things that were described. The wallpaper is specially designed, and the furnishings, each of the furnishings is
Well, that comes from having a
significant.
competent scriptwriter who loves the books, like Eric Kripke. So
Exactly.
if it was somebody who'd never read the books before, but only read it to pick it up and go, hey, let's turn this into a movie, it wouldn't have the same flair. But when you have somebody who actually truly loves it, he's going to infuse that script and make damn sure that the producers are, as long as he is involved in some way, because sometimes you write the script, you hand it off, that's it, you're no longer involved with it. But if the producers care enough about the script to understand what the writer was going for and understand that this is coming from a source material that has a very loyal fan base, they'll do it correctly without hopefully screwing it up. But we'll find out in September. So
Yes. Everybody we met involved with the production seemed extremely anxious to be true to the book, either exactly or in spirit. And there were some things they were changing that they explained why it was necessary, and some things that they checked out to see if it seemed to us that it was appropriate. And I have to say that it looked terrific to me.
Now, is there? Do you have a top pick of your favorite books by John?
Well, I like The Letter of the Witch in the Ring.
Okay.
Because I like Rosrita. I'm a big fan of not his young adult, but his very first book, St. Fidgeta.
Oh, okay.
And beyond that, they all seem good to me. Except, ironically, the one that I like least is the one that has been most consistent, The Face in the Frost. I think that's because it was the first book that John wrote after we were together. And when I typed that manuscript, I typed I don't even remember whether it's called the preface or the foreword or introduction. Anyway, there's a little deal at the beginning that describes the story to come. And it horrified me that it did not seem to me when I finished the book as though that introduction and the book had much of anything to do with each other, and I kept wondering why somebody hadn't corrected that. But clearly it has worked all these years, so others are not as particular. Or I misread it because I was typing. I don't know.
The two books that really grabbed me and made me just hunt down like everything to read and everything that I could possibly find were the Lamp from the Warlock's Tomb and the Spell of the Sorcerer's Skull. And the Spell from the Sorcerer's Skull, in my opinion, at the age of 11, I think is when I first read it, had the most terrifying cover to me. But I couldn't not want to rent it from the library and then not put it down. I just thought out of all of the covers, in my opinion, it had the most like dark, spooky, gothic setting to it that gave me chills. And you have this image of Johnny Dixon staring at this like what looks like a pumpkin in the window. But it's the Sorcerer's Skull, but it looks like a pumpkin.
Right.
And this like ratty looking house or whatever, this field that's like completely this forest that's very empty and it's like very foreboding. And I was just like, I can't not rent this book. And then the other one was, like I said, the Lamp from the Warlock's Tomb, which that is the book that I actually just recently reviewed on my YouTube page.
Oh, I'll have to look at that.
That image also on the front cover where it's is that Johnny Dixon too? No, that's Anthony Munday.
That's Anthony
Munday is staring at that squat little man. You know, he's like looks like he has like stripes on his face. He's got that cloak, and the way John describes that scene, the meeting of those two in the book, I think it's like in the first or second chapter, it was just like Jesus Christ. That scared the crap out of me when I was 11 years old. As an adult now, I'm fine, but I could still remember how I felt reading that. And it was, you know, looking at the, you know, only having the cover image to go based on the back cover and then the front piece, you know, it was a lot of it's John Word's and then of course it's Edward Gorey's artwork as well. Right. How did John and Edward hook up for all those books?
John had no say in who did the illustrating.
Oh.
It was all a matter of the editors and the publishers. And he was thrilled when they recruited Edward Gorey.
Yeah, because Gorey was so huge by that point.
Yes, and John loved his work. So that was a matter of great excitement. He was very disappointed when some of the books were not done by Edward Gorey.
Trust me too. I didn't want to read them. Like The Figure in the Shadows might have been the first book that I picked up. But afterwards, I always cringe at The Figure in the Shadows only because there's no gory artwork. And I'm like, why is he not? Man. And there's a lot of illustrations in that book. Mm-hmm. Whereas the other books, front, back cover, front piece, that's it, and then maybe like a map or a little object somewhere in the book or whatever. But for some reason, decorations. But for some reason, The Figure in the Shadows had the most number of illustrations out of all the books, right?
Yeah, I think he was a cheaper illustrator.
That illustrator I thought was actually pretty good too.
Yeah,
it looked a little,
but didn't have the fame that Gorey did.
But what's funny is when I mentioned earlier I did a book report on it. The second time I did the book report, my stepsister, Deborah, helped me make a diorama of a scene from that book of Lewis walking up the steps with the figure in the shadow and like side of
neat.
Colosseums. She drew Lewis for me, and then we just used him as paper. But we took one of her old Playmobil dolls and a box of toys that she had in the attic or whatever, and we sewed together a cloak for it. And then we
fabulous.
made out of popsicle sticks the columns that Lewis walks up the stairs too as the diorama for the book, because the part of the book report is you had to take a scene and make a diorama of it. I don't know whatever happened to it. I know there's no photographs of it. I would love to have shown you, but I always remember that making a diorama when I was 11 years old.
That's funny.
Yeah.
How did you feel about The Treasure of Alpheus Winterbourne?
That one I don't have a lot. I do remember reading, but I don't have a lot of memory of it. So it is one that I do own, but it's not one that I have a lot of recollection of that I probably have read recently.
It's the only one with nothing supernatural.
Oh, okay.
And John departed from that almost immediately because he was annoyed that some of his books already were being censored by those who object to the supernatural.
That's why I probably don't have much memory of it, because I think that was the book that I said, this has nothing to do with the supernatural.
That's right.
I don't want to finish reading it. I might not have finished reading it.
Okay. And he did not want there to be any sense that he was being pushed away from the supernatural by the criticism that came from people who wanted to censor books for it.
The one book that I have read multiple times, besides The Figure in the Shadows and The House at the Clock in its Walls, is probably The Chessmen of Doom. And I don't know why. I don't know why it's that book that I have read more often than any of the others more times. I always read it during the summer, too, because it is like a summer adventure story. They get out of school. Sure. They go up to Childermiss's old house. Where did John get that whole like young teenage character teaming up with older librarian relationship? Because I mean that like predates like what you see like in Harry Potter, where Harry Potter teams up with like Dumbledore and stuff. Where did he get that dynamic from?
I can't really say I know, except that he was clear that at least for him, for writing a young adult book, he needed to get rid of parents.
Okay.
And that left grandparents or others. And
like Johnny Dixon's father is in the Korean War, right?
Yes.
Okay. Because for anyone not familiar with John's books, and if you're not, thank you for listening to this episode. Go out now and buy them. All of the books take place in post-World War II New England, usually in Maine or Massachusetts, right?
Well, the first one, House with the Clock on Its Walls, is New Zebedee, Michigan.
Okay, but Johnny and Anthony's books take place in like Massachusetts.
Those are all in Massachusetts. Those were after John was living in Massachusetts.
Which you'd always hear Professor Childermiss yelling about the Yankees winning, and of course in 2004 we would have the Red Sox finally win the World Series. But I remember that. Going back to those books, when the Red Sox won the World Series finally, and they had that huge defeat of the Yankees during the playoffs, I remember going back to remembering Professor Childermiss being like, "That damn Yankees," and John writing and swearing that is appropriate for a children's book. Now, when John passed away in 1991, someone else took over his books. What was that author's name again?
Brad Strickland.
Brad Strickland, okay. He doesn't write the books anymore?
Yes, he does. Actually, he was with me while we were visiting the set. He and his wife live near Atlanta, and they also visited at that time. He was also a client of Richard Curtis, the literary agent who was responsible for making John's career successful and who has continued to represent his properties through the present day. And when John died, and Richard was looking for someone to finish the 2 books that John was under contract for, he called Brad and asked him if he was familiar with the work of John Bellairs. And Brad responded by quoting verbatim the entire first paragraph of The Face in the Frost.
Oh, wow.
So there was a match made in heaven, so to speak.
Oh, wow.
And he's been writing ever since. And he knows more about John Bellairs' work than anybody else on earth, I think, since he's been creating it for a number of years.
And what's the most recent book that Brad did?
I'm a bad one to ask about that because I learned in Atlanta that there were books from 2006 and 2007 that I had not realized had come out. So I'm afraid you'll have to check that You'll have to fact check that
Yeah,
somewhere else.
I'm going to fact check that right now. Yeah, he lives in New Holland, Georgia. We definitely probably got to contact him to have him on the show. If you're familiar with him, please pass along to him that
I would strongly recommend that you do that because he is a wonderful raconteur, as good as John, and that's saying a lot.
He doesn't seem to have any contact information, but like I said, please just pass it on to him if you're in contact with him. Hey, you should go over Skype, obviously, because he's in Georgia.
Sure.
Just before we began, you were talking about the books are going to be republished soon, but not through like the Barnes & Noble like they were in the early 2000s.
That's my understanding, yes. The rights to the books were held by Penguin.
Okay, yep.
Penguin had kept House in print, and there's still a Penguin edition of House in print.
Which I'm sure will be coming out, I'm assuming, soon?
It's been continuously in print, so it's out there right now. You can buy a
Okay,
paperback.
all right. But I mean, they're going to put out like some type of special edition to tie into the movie.
I have no idea about that. However, they did not keep the other books in print.
Okay.
And the literary agent, Richard Curtis, found that unfortunate. In the end, Penguin allowed the rights for all the books except House to revert to Richard. And he resold them to another publisher who was willing to bring them out, even though that new publisher did not have the right to House.
And this publishes in Sweden, you said?
And this is in Switzerland, is my understanding.
Sorry. Okay. Do you know why the gory artwork has never been republished in any type of like collection of art?
No, I don't.
I
just don't know.
A big problem a lot of fans have because they have to hunt down. Sometimes some of these books are easy to find. The hardcovers, not so much. But the paperbacks by Penguin are kind of shrunk down the artwork in a way, whereas the hardcovers, the artwork wrapped completely around from top to bottom, no borders or anything. And I've looked online as well. I've been to the Edward Gorey house. Have you ever been there?
I haven't.
Oh my God, it's fantastic. It's a lot of fun.
And I understand there's a Bellairs book on his desk.
Yes, yes, there is. I saw that. I was like, and my girlfriend was like, "Okay, calm down. We'll leave you here." And I asked them too, and they couldn't say why. They said bottom line rights or something. But Edward Gorey's house owns the rights to all of his artwork. But this might have to do with the because they've been published so many different ways, and the copyright of the books has been passed around.
Right,
it might be a big mess to try and sort out. Okay, well, this is what we want to do. We got this movie coming out in Hollywood. We want to take all the artwork from the front and back and the inside and put it in one giant book and publish it. And you'll get some money, and you'll get some money, and you'll get some money, and everyone will be happy and shut up about it. Because I guarantee it's always about who owns the rights to what. Who do we have to pay, and how many different ways do we have to divide it up? Which starts getting expensive because then you start needing getting everyone's lawyers involved to make sure you're getting represented and you're getting represented, and the brother and sister you talked about you know what I mean? And it's well, why does John's wife get money? She didn't write she's not Edward Gorey's wife, and so on and so forth. And the way I'm already talking about it right now in this interview, you can see how this is probably the big problem. Now, you brought in with you some cool visual aids. These are international copies of his books?
There is a Japanese translation that you've got in your hand at the moment.
The House with the Clock in its wall, with a clock in its walls.
Which, of course, opens backwards since you read from
it's like I've read manga before. So, do you know who did the illustrations for this? Because they are in Japanese.
And I believe there's an Italian edition and a French edition. And in the French edition, you'll notice that...
is that the French edition?
Yes. And you'll notice it's Kevin et le Magicien. It is not Louis, but Kevin. I'm not clear why Louis was not a good French name.
And it also says Le Pendule de Halloween. That does not translate, and I do not speak French, but I guarantee that does not translate to the House with the Clock in its walls. That sounds
Halloween clock.
What does pendulum? We will look up right now. What does pendulum mean in pen? I guarantee someone in the comments section of this video, when we post it on YouTube, will be like, "It means this." The clock. Okay, so the clock of Halloween is what it translates to. How do they get that? Because the story doesn't take place at Halloween, does it? It does.
it has a Halloween element in it that I had not been as aware of as I have become.
Yeah.
Okay? That's
It's been a while since I've read the book, and I am going to
Yes.
be rereading the book very soon before the movie comes out. So I maybe have to refresh myself.
so it's not as far out as you think.
Yeah, and then we have La
And then you
Pendula Stregata.
Which is the Italian edition.
Okay.
But the other book that you have is particularly interesting. You'll see there's a note inside it on a separate piece of paper. Unless it has fallen out somewhere.
Oh, this one, the
Yes.
one that has the artwork that's used on the
Yes.
Barnes and Noble editions. Okay.
Because I had to take that to Northern Essex to the linguist in residence there
Uh-huh.
to find out what language it was in. I couldn't figure it out. And you'll see that he has figured out that it is Serbo-Croatian
Oh.
of the type spoken in a particular part of the former Yugoslavia.
Interesting. Do you know what the letter says?
Yeah, sure, that's in English. Read it.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Serbia, including Montenegro, can still be called Yugoslavia. This book is in
Serbo-Croatian.
Okay, the language. Okay, so it's basically just explaining everything. P.S. For a
Right.
second, I tried to read it as Russian. Oh, okay. So they took a little while to try and figure it out as
Exactly.
well. That's interesting. Yeah. So that's Edward's artwork, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the
think
house,
so.
the clock and walls also had a few. Okay, now that I remember it, now looking through this, the house also had a lot of artwork. So it was the house and Shadow are the only two that had multiple pages of artwork. All the other books just had the front, back, and then
fewer,
the fewer pages. So again, it probably costs a lot to hire an artist to do those, but that's awesome. I think this was not just my first exposure to John's work, but that my first exposure to Edward Gorey's artwork as well. And then ever since then, I've always said, when asked who's your favorite artist outside of comic books, I'd say, oh, it's Edward Gorey. And then I asked, who is my favorite author? What's my favorite book series? I've always said, oh, have you ever heard of John Bellairs? And and then surprisingly connected to a lot of people that say, I have heard of those books. I used to read those. And I'm like, right? Weren't they awesome? And so when the movie was announced, I was like, fanning
Hooray.
out, going all over social media with that trailer and like images as much as I could find, but not just images of the movie, but images of John's book, multiple different covers, being like, this is the book it's based on, read this freaking thing, this is so awesome. So I've connected to a lot of fans, and I know a lot of parents as well who have I've exposed my children to those, and I can't wait for this movie to come out as well.
One thing that gave John a great deal of pleasure was the report from many teachers that especially boys who mostly didn't like to read, nevertheless liked to read his books.
I was the same way. It took me a
that
long time to
was
read books outside of comic books, and John's books really got me into reading a lot more. And now it's just a struggle of trying to find the time to read. But
Tell me about that.
with his me doing this YouTube series, I'm trying to reread a lot of his books. Thankfully, they're only about 100 pages or so it's really quick to get through. The other the other two books of his that I was heavily into was The Secret of the Underground Room and The Eyes of the Killer Robot. Which were which is funny, The Eyes of the Killer Robot looks like he's wearing an old baseball uniform. So again, whenever I think of someone talking about stripes, the pinstripes on a baseball player, I always think of The Eyes of the Killer Robot. It immediately comes to mind. Well, do you have any other great little anecdotes or stories or tidbits that you can give us about John?
Well, I remember being in Marshall, Michigan with him in 1976 when the first trilogy was fully published.
Mm-hmm.
And there was still one bookstore in Marshall. And they gave him a card table outside and held a little book signing there.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, John came rushing into the store where I was taking care of our young son and said, "What am I going to do? Aunt Agatha's coming down the street. She's the one I describe in the book as having a voice like an asthmatic tire, with the air coming out." It became quickly apparent that Aunt Agatha and Uncle whoever he was had not read the book and therefore were not insulted, but John was extremely worried because he did draw on the relatives and the people he knew. And one of the favorite Christmas gifts that I gave him was approximately in 1974, was a telephone book from Marshall, Michigan, that reminded him of names and places and stuff that he drew on.
The only other thing I always thought about these would be fantastic for is a like a television series, because every book could become its own episode or 2-part episode, depending how long the episode is. If I don't know if it's more. I don't know if it'd be great to try and cram 100 pages into like an hour-long episode, but
not necessarily. There were 2 TV shows done in the 1970s.
I found them on YouTube. I guess
Good
they're in
for
public
you.
domain, or I don't know if they are in public domain, but they're on YouTube. I don't know who owns them. But I did. Do you remember the names of them?
No.
Yeah, but I think the Mummy.
We
the Will,
saw each of them only once.
I think the Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt is one of them.
That could be.
Yeah, I believe that is the one of them. The Drum, the Doll, and the Zombie was, because I was trying to come up with the name of the Drum and the Doll, the Drum and the Zombie, but I forgot the doll. That's the book actually my son is reading right now. When
nice.
Whenever I pick him up and go to breakfast, I say, okay, why don't we pick up where the book left off? So and he reads it out loud to me. And
That's
I ask
great.
him, are you enjoying it and such? So I'd like him to hopefully get more into those books. I know they're not carried in local libraries anymore today.
I know.
Yeah, which is unfortunate, because I went to the library and I was trying to look for them, and they were like, no, we don't have those. And I was just like,
Well, they'll
damn
have the
it.
chance to buy them all again.
Yes. Well, again, hopefully if the movie is successful, libraries will pick up the entire, and that usually does happen.
Yes.
When even if the movie is not successful, God forbid, the libraries will carry the entire collection of those books connected to it.
Sure.
So, well, again, thank you so much for coming into the studio with us to talk about John. We really do appreciate it, and giving us a little bit of insight into the history and backstory of the novels and your relationship with them, as well as some tidbits about the set of the film, The House with the Clock in Its Walls.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor to be here.
And we look forward to seeing those photos once you are legally allowed to display them.
I will be happy to be in touch with you.
But yes, please keep those secret until September, or your embargo is lifted, or whatever. I'm sure there's somebody you can contact to be like, so when can I put those photos online? They can be like, the day before the movie comes out is fine, or something. Because press screenings are usually like a few days or a week before.
Yes.
So, and as they get right on top of the release of the movie, that's when photos are everywhere anyway, so there's not the worry of like 4 months from now,
right?
You putting the photos and then be like, no, you can't expose the secret of what the back of the house looks like. Or you could always just send them the photos and say, hey, these are the photos we have, which one of these am I allowed to publish, which ones don't have spoilers in it, and they could be like, oh, that's you and that actor, or you and Eli Roth, that's fine, but no, not that one that has that secret, and so on and so forth. But again, thank you so much for coming in the studio.
You're very welcome.